In our next chapter, we are going to discuss psychological disorders, different types of disorders, and what psychological disorders are. And I'd like to begin by showing you a quote, which is really telling about psychological disorders. It was actually written about 500 years ago by Erasmus, and it describes how, in fact, a psychological disorder or insanity has to do with the frequency that particular behavior is observed in a particular culture or society. So in this case, an individual who is marrying a gourd, a pumpkin, is called insane because, according to Erasmus' view, this happens very infrequently. So it tells you that, perhaps we have to think about and revisit our view of what insanity really means. In general, psychological disorders, again, are characterized by this rare or unusual behavior and, I have to add, mental processes that impair proper functioning. So sometimes it includes faulty perception or interpretation of reality. It might include hallucinations, which are perceiving events or stimuli that do not really exist. Severe personal distress, in some cases a problem with perceiving events and ideas of persecution, where the individual believes that there are other individuals in their same environment that are trying to harm them in one way or another. It can include self-defeating behavior, dangerous behavior for the individual, and in general, socially unacceptable behaviors. Historically, the views of psychological disorders have begun with a demonological model where the devil or some kind of a demon was thought to be responsible for the inappropriate behavior of the individual. Then we moved on to the medical model, where we specifically looked at a medical condition, a pure disorder. And contemporary psychological models looks at an interaction between the gene and the environment, nature, nurture, sort of an interaction. There's this vulnerability view where it is believed that we can be biologically inclined to suffering from a particular disorder, and the environment in which we are in particular an environment where there is a lot of stress, may exacerbate and lead to an actual experience of a disorder, where other individuals who are at the same vulnerability level for suffering from a disorder, if they are in a better environment, they might not suffer from it. And so a related view is a biopsychosocial model, where it is believed that there is an interaction between the genetic makeup or biological predisposition, the psychological effects, so the way in which an individual thinks, or it might be even predisposed to psychologically to suffer from a particular disorder, and finally that social aspect of it, so the particular environment in which an individual is in, and the social interaction that they might experience. Right? So it's a combination of biology, psychology, and the social interactions. The classification of psychological disorders comes from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM. We are up to the 5th edition currently, and this manual includes information on medical conditions, psychosocial problems, and how to assess functioning, and scales on how to evaluate particular mental psychological disorders. In terms of the prevalence, it might be surprising you might be surprised to find out that about half of all individuals at one point or another will experience a psychological disorder. Most often these disorders start in childhood or adolescence, so early in life, and at any given time during the same year, about a quarter of all individuals will experience a psychological disorder. So the prevalence of psychological disorder is much greater than most people would think. And we're going to begin our exploration of different disorders with anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders are characterized by worrying and a very dramatic fear of always the worst particular outcome happening, fear of losing control, excessive nervousness, and a general inability to relax. So obviously, as we have discussed before, the psychological response are related to stress. So the individual, as we have discussed in the previous chapter, might go through the GAS response to stress, the generalized anxiety response, and there will be initially an extreme activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system will be overly activated, which leads to, as we have discussed previously, a number of physical as well as psychological problems. The different types of anxiety disorders are classified as phobic disorder, such as having a specific phobia, which is an irrational fear of a specific object or a situation. So for example, there's the arachnophobia, which is the fear of spider. So there's a particular stimulus that an individual is afraid of. Then there are social phobias, which are a persistent fear of being overly scrutinized by other people. So we're always afraid of how other people are going to judge you and evaluate you. And then there is agoraphobia, which some of you might have heard of, which is a fear of being in public places, because in general these individuals believe that they will be unable to escape that public place if something negative happens, if something dangerous happens, and they wouldn't be able to receive help in that social situation, right? So now other types of anxiety disorders are panic disorder, which are characterized by an abrupt attack of acute anxiety, which is not triggered by a specific object or situation. So it includes sudden shortness of breath, sweating, pounding of the heart, which is different from generalized anxiety disorder, which is a persistent anxiety that cannot be attributed to an object, situation, or specific activity. It includes motor tension, autonomic overactivity, and excessive vigilance, where an individual becomes overly nervous about the environment in which they're in. We then have obsessive compulsive disorders. Now, an obsession is defined as a recurrent anxiety-provoking thought or images that appear to be irrational. And a compulsion is a thought, or more frequently a behavior, that the individual engages in to reduce the anxiety connected to the obsession. So the obsession will come first, and then in order to reduce the obsession, the individual will behave in typically ritualistic ways, such as touching something, or it could be counting up to a certain number over and over and over again, and so on. And then we have a stress disorder, which includes post-traumatic stress disorder, which is caused by a traumatic event, and acute stress disorder, which, unlike post-traumatic stress disorder, only happens within a month or even a few days from the stressful event. Right? So an acute stress disorder occurs very close to the stressful situation. Here you have a graph representing sleep problems among Americans before and after September 11th. As you can see, how the September 11 attack have caused a dramatic increase in difficulty falling asleep, or frequent awakening or waking early, and waking tired. So a number of sleeping disorders or problems associated with that anxiety. Now, dissociative disorders, on the other hand, are characterized by a splitting of mental processes, such as thoughts, emotions, even identities. And there are different types of dissociative disorders, such as dissociative amnesia and dissociative fugue. In dissociative amnesia, remember, is a problem with memory, so it's a sudden inability to recall some personal information, which is not due to any biological problem. So there is no problem in the brain. There is no problem with the functioning, the mental functioning of the individual, and all of a sudden this individual suffering from dissociative amnesia forget important personal information, who they are, the fact that they might be married or have kids. Dissociative fugue is when an individual abruptly leaves the home and move to another place with no memory of a previous life. In some cases, there are evidence to the fact that individual, all of a sudden, they will leave their current state, their current home, their families, and take off without leaving any information of where they went. And finally, there is the dissociative identity disorder, this is what was formerly known as multiple personality disorder, and so it's more properly called today dissociative identity, because again there's this dissociation in multiple identities within an individual. So is where, as you probably have seen and characterized in books, in movies, where an individual can take on multiple personalities, multiple identities within the same person. Another class of psychological disorder are somatoform disorders. If you remember, right at the beginning of the semester when we started talking about neurons, the body of the neuron is called the soma, and I told you that soma refers to, generally speaking, the body, right? So somatoforms disorders relates to disorder that, even though they're psychological, they relate to the body. They lead to physical problems such as paralysis, pain, and or a persistent belief that the individual is suffering from a serious disorder, while there is no evidence of a physical abnormality. In a conversion disorder, there is a major change or loss of a physical functioning, such as the inability to move that's a limb, like an arm or a leg, without any explanation of why the individual is unable to physically function in that particular way. So there's no medical or physical explanation of that particular inability. And it is not intentionally produced. The individual is not consciously, at least, able to realize why they're unable to perform that physical function. Then there is the some disorder I'm sure all of you have heard of, is related to a situation in which an individual believes that they're sick, even though there is no medical evidence of any illness. And hypochondriacs may seek the opinion of one doctor after another, believing that the doctor that they're seeing is unable to find something that is seriously wrong with them, so they'll move on to another doctor. They'll often experience some physical illnesses that in fact there's no evidence of. The next class of psychological disorders are mood disorders, which are characterized by disturbances in emotions, emotional reactions, how the emotions are expressed. And one very frequent type of mood disorder is a major depressive disorder, where an individual persistently feels sad, they lose interest in everyday activity, and in particular activity that might produce some positive thought, feeling of worthlessness or guilt, and generally an inability to concentrate. About half of the individual with a major depressive disorder experience some severe symptoms, which includes loss of appetite, extreme weight loss, agitation, and in some cases some psychomotor problems, inability to move. These individuals become sluggish in their actual ability to move around. Another type of mood disorder is bipolar disorder, which involves mood swings. An individual might be extremely happy, ecstatic, elated, feeling the top of the world, and then a short time later fall into a deep depression. So manic behavior, where an individual is in a manic state, the individual becomes very argumentative. They believe they're correct all the time, so they argue with others. They have a number of different ideas and believe that they are the best. And then on the other hand, the depressive behaviors includes lethargy, problem sleeping, and generally a depressive state. There are differences in actually the frequency of depression between males and females. Turns out the females are twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression as compared to males. And some of the possible explanation have to do with the female hormone or estrogen. Males have estrogen as well, but to a much less extent than female. And it could be due to the fact that females are more likely to ruminate, which means to think about problems over and over again and don't let it go. Suicide is related to these mood disorders, and it is the third leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 15 and 24, young adults, teenagers and young adults. And the risk factors related to suicide has to do with feeling depressed, hopeless, like we talked about the idea that hopelessness can lead to a situation where an individual believe that they have no control over their life. It also related to the possibility of an increased frequency of psychological problems in adolescence due to the changes that occurs during that time in life, so stressful life events. And also there is a familiarity, so it runs in families in terms of a genetic connection with the possibility of suicide and depression. And schizophrenia is our last psychological disorders that we are going to discuss. Is, as you probably know, severe psychological disorders characterized by problems in thinking, language, perception and attention, so often associated with hallucination, so the perception of stimuli that are non-existent, such as seeing things that are not there, or hearing voices that are not there. Problems paying attention, depending on the type of schizophrenia. It's also related with motor problems, mood, and also withdrawal, and sort of an encapsulation where the individual becomes sort of separates himself or herself from others. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, this hallucination can be visual or auditory, and the motor activity may become either very wild, or on the other hand very slowed, and so this idea of a stupor, where an individual becomes almost unresponsive to outside stimulation. And there are actually three classes of schizophrenia. There's paranoid schizophrenia, disorganized schizophrenia, and catatonic schizophrenia. Paranoid schizophrenia is associated with problems of delusion, where the individual becomes obsessed with the fact that other individuals are trying to harm them. Disorganized schizophrenia has to do with being all over the place, incoherent. There is an extreme social impairment, dealing with other people properly. And catatonic schizophrenia has to do with a severe motor impairment. So the individual will become almost motionless. They will stay in the same position for long period of time. Typically, you can imagine sitting on a chair, not moving around a lot, and being very withdrawn from their social environment. Now, in this graph, you can appreciate the relationship between schizophrenia and family relationship. There's a 40% probability of suffering from schizophrenia in identical twins. So if one twin suffers from schizophrenia, the other one's about, has a 1 in 2 probability of developing schizophrenia as well. Fraternal twins go, significantly down. So you can see the biological aspect of this relationship here, where identical twins have the same DNA. Fraternal twins only have half of their DNA being the same. So you go from a 48% to less than half of a probability of as much of a probability of developing schizophrenia in fraternal. And then siblings, children and parents, siblings, parents, and go on and so on. So there's obviously some biological connection, although it is not 100%, because otherwise you would expect an identical twin who suffers from schizophrenia to have its twin suffering from schizophrenia 100% of the time, which is not the case. So the current view of schizophrenia is that biopsychosocial model that I mentioned in the beginning of this discussion, where the psychological disorder, in this case namely schizophrenia, is likely caused by a combination of biological factors, social or socio-cultural factors, and psychological factors. So stress can certainly be a cause for it. Family discord or frequent family fights, when the mother and the father of the individual are fighting very frequently when they're young, and typically poor quality of parenting. Biological factors include genetic vulnerability and some particular biological aspect of their brain functioning, which includes over use of dopamine. I believe we talked a little bit about that possibility when we were discussing biopsychology earlier in the semester, where it is believed that in part schizophrenia can be caused by an larger than usual number of receptors in the brain that process dopamine in the centers of the brain where emotions are processed. And some viral infections as well, some birth complications are related to schizophrenia. And finally, social and sociocultural factors, which involves poverty, overcrowding, the same environment, poor quality of parenting, which, as you remember, is also a psychological factors, so that it has a dual impact, and also malnutrition. So again, we have to think that in some cases a number of psychological disorders can make themselves, can appear in an individual as a result of a combination of factors, right? Typically, again, biological, psychological, and sociocultural. If you only have like one, let's say, negative effects coming from one of these factors, then you might not really develop the disorder. Or even if you have two of these, might not lead to an actual experiencing the disorder. But the combination of them can ultimately give rise to the experiencing of a disorder in an individual.